In a book titled The Secrets of the Federal Reserve by the late Eustace Mullins, it described how US Senator Nelson Aldrich had a secret Jekyll Island meeting in November 1910 to create a private central bank, and one of its attendees, the German-born banker Paul M. Warburg, has been described as its chief architect. The book asserted that this bank was behind the financial crash of 1929 that was used to paralyze the economic structure of the world and to create a global depression, and it quotes a New York Times article to prove its case. Whether it is true or not, the narrator cannot say, but in the 1930s, central bankers created the little-known Bank of International Settlements that aligned all the central banks in the West into one clique. Its mastermind standing on the far right was Horace Greeley Hjalmar Schacht, Adolf Hitler's Minister of Economics, who stands next to Montagu Norman, Governor of the Bank of England, where he stands next to US banker Benjamin Strong, Governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Though little is known about this elite private club of central bankers, there are many who believe that these central banks are behind the financing of modern warfare, and according to the South China Morning Post, the coronavirus could trigger a global financial crisis, and they say that the central bankers are to blame. So many believe that the bankers rule, but let us go into the archives of credible sources in both aristocratic, military, and political circles to see who are the real players who are pulling the strings on the world stage and who plans events years ahead of its time. The late Edith Starr Miller was a New York socialite, the only child of a wealthy industrialist who married an English nobleman, Almeric Hugh Paget, 1st Baron Queensberry, where she got the title Lady Queensberry. She spent 10 years researching a book, but she died a number of months before her book was even published in 1933. Despite her own biases and political views, she tells the reader in her book Occult Theocracy that it is not designed to be a scholarly, literary work and that each person must come to their own conclusions, but she outlines who are pulling the strings. She said that the esoteric aims of most societies are all directed towards the same end, namely, the concentration of political, economic, and intellectual power into the hands of a small group of individuals, each of whom controls a branch of the international life, material, and spiritual of the world today. The main branches thus controlled are, and highlighted in red, number one, the international banking groups and their subsidiaries, and number two, international industrial and commercial control groups with their interlocking directorates. She wasn't alone in her conclusions. Major General Smedley Darlington Butler was the most decorated man in the US military at the time of his death in 1940. He would travel throughout the United States of America and he would see hundreds and thousands of graves of innocent dead soldiers in cemeteries, and he was very sad that it was a few corporations and many men who had profited from war while others died. So he documented his deep frustrations in a book titled War is a Racket, and he pretty much comes to the same conclusion as Lady Queensberry. When writing about World War I, he said that war is a racket. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. Let us not forget the bankers who financed the war. If anyone had the cream of the profits, it was, and highlighted in red, the bankers. Other patriotic and highlighted in red again, industrialists and speculators chiseled their way into war profits. The late political scientist Zbigniew Brzezinski was the National Security Advisor to US President Jimmy Carter. He wrote a book in 1970 titled Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technocratic Era, and he had inside knowledge and documented that the international banks, and repeating the previous two, multinational corporations who are acting and planning in terms that are in advance of the political concepts of the nation state. An English economist and journalist, Rodney Atkinson, the elder brother of the English comedian Rowan Atkinson, wrote a book titled Europe's Full Circle in 1996, and he repeated the same words as Brzezinski, and also said that the principal element of fascism is a system of corporate and collective power. The trade unionists, and highlighted in red, bankers and multinational corporations who have for decades attended the meetings of corporate elites find that linguistic, cultural, parliamentary and religious differences are all barriers to their supernatural structures and controls. The Hoover Institute on War, Revolution, and Peace in Stanford University in California is a think tank and war archive. The late US-based British economist Anthony C. Sutton, while a staff there, had privy access to many sensitive documents, and he wrote a number of books from this material he acquired, and from state documents he proved that Wall Street is a huge main player in covertly financing both wars and revolutions to benefit a small corporate monopoly. Anthony C. Sutton added one more to the system and said that foreign policy is the acquisition of markets and economic power, profit, if you will, for a small group of, and highlighted in red, giant multinationals under the virtual control of a few banking investment houses, and the other one is the controlling families. When former MI5 agent Benito Mussolini rose into power to introduce fascism into the 20th century, many are familiar with his complete support by the papacy with the signing of the Lateran Treaty of 1929. But it would have been impossible for religion alone to propel Mussolini into power. He had political support from English statesman Winston Churchill while he was the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, as documented in the New York Times on January 21st, 1927. When President Roosevelt was in power, in his personal archives there is a letter from Benito Mussolini to Roosevelt commending him on how they should work together. So we had support from Cardinal Pietro Gasparri, the Vatican Secretary of State, the Italian monarch Victor Emmanuel III, and the little-known US banker Thomas William Lamont Jr., who on behalf of J.P. Morgan gave Benito Mussolini a loan in order to start up fascism as documented in the New York Times on April 14, 1925. One man who fled fascist Italy documented in a book titled The Dollar and the Vatican how it worked, and the late Avram Manhattan repeated and elaborated on the main players on the world stage. And when describing the rise of fascism, he said that European vested interests, ranging from, and highlighted in red, monarchies to high industrial and financial magnates, and the respectable middle classes, these, even more readily than their American counterparts, sided instantly with fascism and brought it to power. The Vatican and European and American capitalism acted systematically and in concord from the very beginning. Although at first independently, they soon joined forces, and American capitalism played a more important part in helping the rise of fascism than is generally realized. Avram Manhattan said it was the bankers, monarchies, industrialists, and specifically Western capitalism in both Europe and in America that created fascism in Italy. And another man also confirmed that they are the only ones who have the power to recreate it all over again in the future. The champions of Western capitalism, Malachi Martin said, the transnationalists and internationalists of America and Europe appear to be far and away the most effective and powerful architects of the New World Order, for the simple reason that their power base rests on the indispensable pillars of, and please look at the words underlined, money and technology. Please take a screenshot of that quote so you can understand how the New World Order really works. And we will briefly look at a very destructive model of one of the first attempts in modern times to control the entire planet. It was during the Second World War.
Here they come.
What are we gonna do?
We'll bring hell down from on high.
Americans loved to throw it in people's face that it was they who saved the world from European fascism. That is far from the truth. They profited from the first, and they would also profit from the second. Major General Smedley Butler said that in the World War I, a mere handful garnered the profits of the conflict. At least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were made in the United States during the World War. Anthony C. Sutton, whose research is now getting clearer light, documented that it was a corporate takeover of the world that was responsible for the Second World War, where it was Wall Street who financed and who put into power both the Führer Adolf Hitler in Germany and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the United States of America, who both not by coincidence, came into power in the same year, in 1933, and both had the eagle as their symbol. That's very interesting. President FDR was a perfect candidate for his role who ticks all of the right boxes. He was born into two prominent business families, the Delanos and the Roosevelts. His great-grandfather, James Roosevelt, founded the Bank of New York, so he was born into a banking dynasty, and he himself was a Wall Street banker. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was his fifth cousin, was the daughter of Elliott Bullock Roosevelt, the younger brother of 26 U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. The 28th U.S. President, Woodrow Wilson, appointed his mother's brother and his favorite uncle, Frederick Adrian Delano II, on the board of the newly founded Federal Reserve Bank, who is seated on the bottom right of this picture, where he became its first vice chair, and FDR also appointed his uncle as an advisor in his government. FDR was also initiated as a Scottish Rite Freemason, so he was a member of a secret society, who was born into a prominent influential family with strong industrial and banking connections. He tried to downplay something that he was attempting to do. If you carefully look at the words on this monument, he said that those who seek to establish systems of government based on the regimentation of all human beings by a handful of individual rulers call this a new order. It is not new, and it is not order. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States of America, attempted to introduce Mussolini's corporate fascist system into the United States of America. What many people are unaware of is that according to the Washington Post, Mussolini was highly praised by the United States when he came into power as a strongman for doing away with communism. In Forbes magazine in 2012, it confirms that Mussolini's fascist economic policy was a model for the United States government during the 1930s. It also documents that Mahatma Gandhi, the so-called Hindu peacemaker, also praised Benito Mussolini. President Roosevelt attempted to introduce Mussolini's model in the year he was elected in 1933. It was titled the National Recovery Administration, or its abbreviation, the NRA. To make it as simple as possible for the average person to understand what the aim of the NRA was, it allowed a small number of large companies or monopolies to dominate the market that would eliminate or crush any competition, especially from small businesses, or, as Rodney Atkinson said, fascism is a corporate takeover of the world. The United States Supreme Court, under its head Chief Justice, Charles Evans Hughes, got rid of it, for they knew it did not represent the historical democratic principles of the United States. We will quote a number of credible sources to confirm what the NRA was and show that Roosevelt was only a face for the plans of a corporate takeover and how it is being repeated over again today. Anthony C. Sutton said that the economic recovery part of the New Deal was a creation of Wall Street, specifically Bernard Baruch and Gerald Swope of General Electric, in the form of the Swope Plan. Walter Teagle was one of the key administrators of NRA. President Roosevelt had abandoned the small businessman of the United States to the control of Wall Street. Fortunately, NRA failed. Big business attempted to oppress the little man. The codes were riddled with abuses and inconsistencies. It was put out of its misery by the Supreme Court in a Schechter-Poucher decision of 1935, although its failure was evident long before the Supreme Court decision. Though it failed, there was one system who not only praised FDR's NRA, but was also watching attentively and patiently with the hope that it would be reinstalled, for it would greatly benefit this system who has longed to regain control over the entire world, the papacy. In a book titled Behind the Dictators, published in 1942 and written by an ex-Catholic priest, Leo Lehman, he said that the National Catholic Welfare Conference praised the NRA, which is now admitted as having been patterned on fascist corporative lines and which was abolished by unanimous opinion of the US Supreme Court as destructive of American democracy. In spite of this, however, this plan of the Catholic Church says, had the NRA been permitted to continue, it could have readily been developed into the kind of industrial order recommended by the Holy Father, the Pope. John Flynn in the New York World Telegram, July 12, 1940, states that by the NRA, President Roosevelt unwittingly attempted to introduce this feature of fascism into our country. For these cooperatives are the means through which the leader exercises his dictatorial will. Corporatism is indeed the economic ingredient of fascism. The entire ideology of fascism and Nazism in social, economic, educational, religious, and military matters is contained in the corporate system, as Lady Quimber said. Corporatism is fascism. His words have also been confirmed by one who was working inside of the US government. In the personal memoirs of President Herbert Hoover, we get an insight to how the US government really works. The narrator was first exposed to him where, as a trained mining engineer with vast business contacts, Hoover cut a business deal in Liberia in West Africa on behalf of the US rubber industry and the Firestone Company. He sabotaged the plans of the Pan-Africanist, the Right Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who had first made a deal with Charles Burgess King, the 17th president of Liberia, for a UNIA Back to Africa settlement program in the Republic of Liberia in the 1920s. Hoover was a man who was well connected in and out of office. He met with Adolf Hitler, Pope Pius XII, Belgian banker Emile Franqui, as confirmed by the New York Times 1931. Though a product of Wall Street also, he described how destructive his successor's NRA plan was. He said that among the early Roosevelt fascist measures was the National Recovery Act, the NRA of June 16, 1933. The origins of this scheme are worth repeating. These ideas were first suggested by Gerard Swope of the General Electric Company at a meeting of the electric industry in the winter of 1932. So a year before FDR was elected, businessman Gerard Swope, the president of General Electric, first suggested this fascist corporate system. And in this original transfer slip that Anthony C. Sutton got from the Hoover Institute's files from the Nuremberg Military Tribunal from General Electric, it is dated to March 2nd, 1933, and it is 60,000 Reichsmarks that was used to elect Adolf Hitler into office. Following this, they were adopted by the United States Chamber of Commerce. I tried to show him that this stuff was sheer fascism, that it was merely a remaking of Mussolini's corporate state, and refused to have any of it. So President Hoover knew that the United States was being remodeled on Mussolini's fascism, and he repeated what both Rodney Atkinson and Leo Lehman both said. He said that now with the NRA, he said Roosevelt shackled his common man to unrestrained monopolies. The act, as drafted by the administration, was passed by rubber stamp methods on May 1933. NRA codes have been crushing the life out of small business. So for fascism to ever work and to be successful, monopolies or big corporations have to crush competition of small businesses.
The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the dominance of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. Any single action by one of these companies can affect hundreds of millions of us in profound and lasting ways. These companies, as they exist today, have monopoly power. Their dominance is killing the small businesses, manufacturing, and overall dynamism that are the engines of the American economy.
If you're the owner of a small business experiencing hardship due to the recent coronavirus, COVID-19, the U.S. Small Business Administration is offering low-interest loans to help you get through these challenging times.
Tonight, the race is on for small businesses to apply for a new round of government funding.
The resurgence of COVID-19 this week has brought deepening anxiety for millions of small businesses.
Small businesses around the country are bearing the economic brunt of the coronavirus pandemic.
The
toll this is taking on small businesses in the country, I don't think can be overestimated. There's a lot of people who are closing down, especially restaurants and, small businesses across the country.
These are the 5 most valuable companies in America. Notice anything? They're all tech companies, and their dominance is attracting attention from watchdog groups that say their market power is harming competition and the economy.
Can you imagine life without Google, Facebook, or Amazon? Chances are you're actually on one of those platforms right now watching this.
What is happening now, in my view, is a neo-feudalism, where the Zuckerbergs and Bezoses of the world are basically becoming the new lord and ladies.
The government has opened up an antitrust review of big tech, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple. Do you share the government's concerns that any one of these companies, or all of them perhaps, are doing things, abusing their power and influence in such a way that it undermines either the political system, and we've heard about that, or perhaps the consumer economy, and we've heard about that too?
You could say I'm biased, but I see these as well-meaning, highly innovative companies that it's up to society to make sure that their innovation doesn't have negative side effects.
The reason why Google and Facebook are the most powerful companies in the world is because last year data surpassed oil in value. Data is the most valuable asset on Earth.
When people see the extent of the surveillance, I think they're going to be shocked.
Once again, their control of the marketplace allows them to do whatever it takes to crush independent business and expand their own power. This must end.
Is public money going to tech firms like Google, like Amazon, to perform public functions? So once again, a bonanza for the tech companies, who, by the way, have been doing very well during the pandemic already, where they see huge opportunities in telehealth, in the educational market, in public schools, in supporting us working from home and learning from home. They're not looking for a kind of a traditional reopening, but rather a new paradigm.
In the book, The Shock Doctrine, Canadian author and filmmaker Naomi Klein has labeled this as disaster capitalism. It is when corporations that are usually kept in check through Western democratic laws can, in a crisis, act with immunity and take full advantage of a crisis, as Rahm Emanuel said at the opening of the study, and not only make huge profits, but also strip away people's freedoms for the so-called common good and safety of society, as we shall see near the end of the study. Even though recent studies have shown that almost 5 times as many people in the UK are now dying of influenza or pneumonia than COVID-19, according to the latest data from the Office for National Statistics in the UK in August 2020. That's interesting. They've bullied out smaller companies who will pose any competitive threat to them, and they have definitely capitalized on the COVID-19 lockdown to expand their global interests. And even if we are observing how they work, we all have to admit that during the lockdown, we have had to some degree, depend upon their services. What the United States Supreme Court blocked in the 1930s to stop corporate fascism from spreading and taking root in the United States, disaster capitalism in the 21st century has allowed these 5 tech companies to take almost complete control over the global economy, where they can affect nearly every aspect of our everyday lives with no restraints. And as Malachi Martin said, money and technology will be one of the main controlling tools to harness the New World Order. What is downplayed is how deeply these tech companies are embedded with the US government and the secret intelligence services. Microsoft is a bit more bold and defends its ties to the military with no apologies. But according to NBC News, there are thousands of contracts that highlight very quiet ties between big tech and US military, a covert liaison where big tech has merged with Big Brother. Not surprising at all. The CIA admits on her own website that it was her who actually created Google Earth. So the government and Big Brother have always had a bond. We're getting to the point where there will be no reversing the trends of these tech companies' control. And Leo Lehman said they will allow a dictator to do as he pleases. We can only imagine what is planned for the future. These tech companies are fulfilling the plans of the little-known but well-connected political advisor and Wall Street financier and millionaire Bernard Baruch, who, while working in the Woodrow Wilson administration in 1918, seated in this photo second from left, he created the War Industries Board, the forerunner to the NRA, for a few monopolies to have complete corporate takeover of the market. And he was not only the political advisor to FDR, but the behind-the-scenes mastermind of his presidential campaign, where he got bankers and corporations to financially bankroll him into the presidency. But Adolf Hitler was also fully financially backed by Wall Street. And though he has been played in satire to downplay his role, the 20th century bloodbath that has been cleverly labeled a world war was actually a European conflict from the beginning to the end, with the US corporate financial backing that drew the rest of the world in, that sadly came at a very, very deadly price. Avram Manhattan said, "What was their cost in blood? World War I was more destructive than the 901 major wars of the past 2,400 years, 7 times more destructive than all of them combined. World War II was 4 times worse than World War I."
We believe that the Nazis and the fascists have asked for it, and they're going to get it.
An fremde Hilfe niemals! An Hilfe, die außerhalb unserer eigenen Nation, unseres eigenen Volkes liegt. In uns selbst allein liegt die Zukunft.
Adolf Hitler, though he was an Austrian, said in that speech that the Germans should not depend upon foreign help. But where did the majority of the financial support he received to sustain his war industry come from?
Don't sweat it, because when it comes to work, Ford Commercial Vehicles can take it and bring it and flat out work it. You might say they're wired for success. Ford Trucks and Vans, year after year, America's best-selling line of commercial vehicles.
Hi everybody, I'm Graham from Ford. Today we're marking the end of 91 years of manufacturing in Australia.
By the end of June, Ford's joint venture in Russia, Ford Solars, will close 3 of its 4 factories, stopping its production of passenger cars in the country and eliminating thousands of jobs.
U.S. car maker Ford says it will close its Bridgend engine plant in South Wales in September 2020.
Well, we're also following the auto industry right now. They are the latest victim of the virus outbreak, along with retailers and grocers. Detroit's automakers have just agreed to close all their factories, both Ford and GM confirming to Fox Business just moments ago.
For the past couple of years, both Ford and General Motors have been closing down their plants all over the world, losing sales where thousands of livelihoods are being threatened. In their zenith during the Second World War, when US soldiers arrived in Nazi Germany, they discovered, like the soldiers a few decades later in Vietnam, that their enemies in combat had American-made vehicles and weapons. The narrator got this article in the British newspaper The Daily Mail in the year 1998 that showed that the Nazis were receiving an import of vehicles from both General Motors and Ford, where there have been lawsuits that have been filed against these companies. Henry Ford, the US billionaire American industrialist, was a strong Nazi sympathizer who greatly admired Adolf Hitler. For his services to the Nazis, he was awarded the Grand Cross of the German Eagle in 1938 by Adolf Hitler. His services were also praised by Charles Coughlin, the Canadian-American Roman Catholic priest, and also a Hitler and Mussolini fascist Nazi sympathizer, as documented in the New York Times, September 6, 1933. The year the NRA was launched. Alfred P. Stone Jr. was the US President, Chairman, and CEO of General Motors Corporation, who was also conducting business with Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. His representative abroad, American engineer James D. Mooney, the president of General Motors overseas, was also given the same award as Henry Ford, as documented in the New York Times, August 11, 1938.
Today, there are more sensors on our planet than people. We're putting AI into everything and everything into the cloud. It's all so smart, because smart only really matters when we put it to work. Not just for a few of us, but for all of us. Let's put smart to work.
It can sometimes take years after an event, after many of the players are long dead, that classified documents are declassified for public viewing. And at the opening of the 21st century, many articles emerged of IBM's collaboration with the Nazis. It was through the intense efforts of one man's investigative research that he wrote in a book titled IBM and the Holocaust. It was by the investigative journalist Edwin Black, and he documented how Thomas J. Watson, the American businessman, CEO, chairman, and co-founder of IBM, conducted his business interests abroad. This photo shows him standing and speaking in front of a podium, and seated on his left is General Eisenhower, who later became a US president. This photo shows him standing on the far right, and in the center with a sleeveless dress is the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of President Roosevelt. He was well connected. But this photo shows Adolf Hitler seated on the far left, and sitting beside him on his right, conducting business with him, is Thomas J. Watson on June 28, 1937. Remember, war is a business. But who financially bankrolled Adolf Hitler?
JP Morgan Chase is a global company that has 260,000 employees and 40,000 technologists strong. Together, our business and technologists are developing next-generation platforms that move trillions of dollars throughout the global financial system.
It may be very hard for many people to stomach that the Western banks that they have a current account with were, at one time, doing business with the Nazis. But there were others who wanted to benefit from the dictators of Europe also. In May 2020, German Roman Catholic bishops made a public apology for their predecessors' disgusting role in the war crimes of Nazi Germany. Though the papacy is usually protected by historians and the media, every now and then a fact here and there is leaked out of how much of a role she has played in a major conflict. One man was an insider to the papacy support of the Führer. In the memoirs of Franz von Papen, the former Vice-Chancellor of Germany, published in 1952, it records the concordat between the Vatican and Nazi Germany that was signed on the 20th of July, 1933, where von Papen is seated on the left, and Monsignor Eugenio Pacelli, who later became Pope Pius XII, is seated in the center. Von Papen later became a member of Hitler's first cabinet, where he is seated in the far right next to Adolf Hitler, and he shared his experience. He said that the Knights of Malta, of which I was a member, in Rome at Easter 1933, I went to negotiate the terms of the Concordat with Germany. There has been no Concordat between the Vatican and the Reich since the Reformation. The Vatican, therefore, had an intimate knowledge of conditions in Germany in 1933. An audience with Pope Pius XI, His Holiness welcomed my wife and myself most graciously, and remarked how pleased he was that the German government now had at its head a man uncompromisingly opposed to communism and Russian nihilism in all its forms. Franz von Papen confirms with his dialogue with Pope Pius XI that the Pope endorsed and supported the rise of Adolf Hitler. These are his own words. He continues. The whole question of the finances of the Nazi movement at this period has become one of the most controversial issues connected with Hitler's eventual rise to power. The most documented account of the National Socialist sudden acquisition of funds was contained in a book published in 1933 called Die Gelbroden von het National Socialism. The author's name was given as Sidney Warburg, and he gave an exhaustive list of names, dates, and payments. The alleged author's thesis was that the American financial interests had sought to protect their investments in Europe by placing at the disposal of the Nazi Party, through various intermediaries and highlighted in red, banking houses, considerable sums of money to instigate a national revolution and ensure Germany's financial stability. His words were to be elaborated upon in more detail in another memoir, this time coming from one in the US government. In Ambassador Dodd's diary, published in 1941, the US diplomat and historian William E. Dodd, the United States ambassador to Germany from 1933 to 1937, documented the role of two prominent men: US banker Winthrop Aldrich, the son of Nelson Aldrich on the left, And on the right is Ivy Lee, the man who is credited as the father of modern public relations. They were both to conduct a business with Adolf Hitler. This monument of Ivy Lee documents on lines 9 and 10 that he was a business client of John D. Rockefeller, so he is well connected in the business world. John D. Rockefeller Sr. is seated on the left with his grandchild on his lap. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., stands above him, and Jr.'s wife, who is seated on the right, is Abigail Green Aldrich, later to be called a Rockefeller, who was the daughter of Nelson Aldrich and the brother to Winthrop Aldrich. The Rockefellers founded the Standard Oil Company, at the time the largest oil company in the world, and Walter C. Teagle, who managed the NRA in President Roosevelt's government, was on the board of I.G. Farben and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, who was also the chairman and president of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey. What role did he play in the development of the Nazi war government? William E. Dodd was shocked when he recorded in his diary and said, "Why did the Standard Oil Company of New York send $1 million over here, that is in Nazi Germany, in December 1933, to aid the Germans in making gasoline from soft coal for war emergencies?" Naive to world affairs, William Dodd was totally clueless that President Roosevelt was also backed by his Wall Street oil interests. In a nutshell, it would have been totally impossible for the Nazis, planes, cars, jeeps, tanks, warships, and submarines to function without US imported oil, for Germany has no oil reserves. Like William Dodd, this may be very shocking and disturbing for people who have been given a different narrative of the Second World War. But never forget these words from the narrator. War is a business. William Dodd continues. Winthrop W. Aldrich, president of the Chase National Bank of New York, was on his way to Hitler's quarters with the Reichsbank president Schacht and the Minister of Economics Schmidt. Henry Mann of the National City Bank spoke of the conversation he and Mr. Aldrich had had some 10 days with the Chancellor at his summer palace. He, Adolf Hitler, has no conception of international relationships. He considers himself a German messiah, but despite Hitler's attitude, these bankers feel they can work with him.